There are times when a victory feels more like a defeat. For India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India's recent general election may be just such a melancholy occasion. After 642 million votes were counted, Modi won his third term, but less convincingly than he anticipated. His Bharatiya Janata Party lost 63 of the 303 seats they held before polls opened, and will now be reliant on smaller coalition partners to make up a majority in the Lok Sabha. If Modi is a diminished figure at home, he may become keener to assert himself abroad. Any Indian Prime Minister can help themselves to as many foreign policy headaches as they fancy enduring, and need look no further than just over the country's borders. To India's east, a civil war in Myanmar threatens to spill over into the border states of Nagaland, Manipur and Mizoram. To the west is the perennially rancorous relationship with Pakistan. And to the north, China, in some respects an uneasy ally, in other respects a potential enemy. Modi's approach to domestic politics has been characterised by an often reckless willingness to stoke division and conflict. This is, or so it might be hoped, less of an option when dealing with large and volatile neighbours, two of whom are, as India is, armed with nuclear weapons. Will Modi's approach to India's neighbours change during his third term? Will China, Pakistan, Myanmar and Bangladesh believe that his influence is ebbing? And was there ever, a Modi doctrine? This is the Foreign Desk.
As of now, there are no high commissioners of Pakistan or India in their embassies, and trade has been suspended. And what we see, the environment right now is such that there is absolutely no signs that there would be a resumption of dialogue between India and Pakistan.
The BJP's line is always very much about India as a Hindu country. That's their political agenda. So the idea that they're holding back a potential hordes of arrivals from a Muslim majority country, I think they then see, well, if that's going to work as a political argument, maybe we can use the same argument about other groups as well.
The view in China used to be that India was the best argument against democracy that you could possibly have, because if you compared China's pace of development, it had outstripped India by many factors. But now, India is actually, in growth terms, it's growing at 7% and China's growing at 3%.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. I'm joined first of all by Kapil Komireddi, Indian writer and author of Malevolent Republic, A Short History of the New India. Kapil joins us from Hyderabad. Kapil, let's start with the big question. When we do think of Narendra Modi and foreign policy, would we be able to say that there's anything actually as coherent as a Modi doctrine?
Modi's foreign policy, as you know, Andrew, is a continuation in some respects of India's old attitude to the world, which is that India doesn't enter into alliances, it has partnerships, and it doesn't want to belong to either camp, the Western camp or now what is emerging as the Russo-Chinese camp. India has excellent relations with Russia traditionally, and it's trying to move closer to the West, but all the while trying to emphasize that it is not going to be an ally of the West. And if you speak to Americans, they often tell you that they don't expect India to fight for their ideas. They don't expect India to go to war with China over Taiwan, for instance. But what they want is for India to create the impression that it is a force against China.
Is there anything then new in Modi's foreign policy approach in the same way that there has been something new in his domestic policy approach, i.e. this emphasis on a very Hindu nationalist idea of India? Is that reflected at all in his dealings overseas, or is that just for domestic consumption?
It's such a good question. Modi has created this impression that he is highly sought after by the West. He calls himself the teacher, the preceptor to the world. The impression created here is that all the world leaders look to him for guidance. And I think the reliability on it, Modi has got lucky in that India is emerging as an important player just when there are great crises emerging in the West over Ukraine and now in Israel. And people are courting India because it is such a big country. It's a major democracy, and Modi has used this to his advantage. Last year, India hosted the G20, and Modi tried to pass that off as something he'd organised personally, even though it was rotating presidency. So in one way, India has become more assertive on the world stage, but that assertiveness has been permitted by circumstances and not by Modi's genius to corner other powers.
You mention Israel and Ukraine, which are the two foreign policy crises most preoccupying the Western world, at least. Has he expressed much interest in either of them? I know he is maintaining friendly relations with Russia, as you said. He's been generally vaguely supportive of Israel, which I think is one of the things that has contributed to this slightly strange recent falling out with the Maldives. But is he basically trying to avoid taking a position as far as possible?
On Gaza, his foreign minister is very clear that there should be an independent Palestinian state. That has been the stance of India. And in muted ways, India continues to express that. And whenever there's an occasion at the United Nations, India formally takes that position. But the Prime Minister himself, as far as optics are concerned, he stands very strongly with Netanyahu and with Israel. And the message is that India is a friend of Israel, and it will not back down from that friendship. It will not move away from Israel in order to appease domestic critics of the Prime Minister.
And on Ukraine, does he have any particular view on that? Or is it just an attempt to not get drawn into what he sees as somebody else's squabble?
My understanding is that he's tried to play a peacemaker in the hope that he will win a Nobel Prize. He's sent some emissaries, and he's claimed within India that he was responsible for a brief pause in the war, not only in Ukraine, but also in Gaza. In Ukraine, it was to pull Indian students out of Ukraine, and in Gaza, it was because he wanted Muslims in Gaza to have a break from the war during Ramadan, neither of which are substantiated by facts, but that is what he's succeeded in selling to the electorate here. And clearly, the electorate hasn't fallen for it.
When Modi does take centre stage on the world stage, as it were, do we see anything different in the way he presents himself versus previous Indian prime ministers? If we think, say, for example, hosting the G20 last year, did he sort of pitch himself as just the humbly welcoming host, or is this thing where he's very anxious to portray himself as the embodiment of the state?
He very much portrays himself as a man of destiny, and the difference between Modi and his predecessors, at least for the past 40 years, I can't think of another leader who projected himself on the world stage as Modi has done. Modi takes great care, puts in a lot of effort to ensure that wherever he goes, he holds a lavish reception with overseas Indians, Indian expatriates, and he tries to show to his hosts, if they're democratic hosts, he tries to show them that there are great many people in their countries who are admirers of Modi, and they will support any leader who backs Modi. And quite a few leaders, especially Australia, they've gone out of their way to say very sycophantic things about Modi in the hope of winning the votes of his supporters in Australia.
I mean, it is a conventional wisdom that there are no votes in foreign policy and that foreign policy is rarely a factor in elections. But when Modi does project himself on the world stage like that, as you say, that self-conscious embodiment of India, does that register with domestic audiences at all? Do you think it impresses anybody?
Hugely. I've been travelling in India since September, and I've been struck by how much people admire Modi because they see him as having made India respectable on the world stage. I was astonished by that. I didn't think Indians cared so much about how the world viewed them, but clearly they do. They see India as emerging from its old history of being a colony of the British, a country that was not taken seriously by world powers, to being a country that is very consequential on the world stage. And that has played greatly to Modi's advantage.
Just finally, and on that thought, it is a commonplace of authoritarian strongmen. One thinks most obviously in this respect of Vladimir Putin, that however mighty the country they lead, they nevertheless appeal, at least domestically, to a certain amount of persecution complex, this idea that there are great foes and great enemies ranged against them. Do we hear or see any of that from Narendra Modi?
He knows that the great threat comes from China, and he's played that down because he's unable to take on China. So Pakistan has functioned as the punching bag, but he's occasionally tended to say that the West, if he wasn't there, the West would have cornered India. It would have compelled India into supporting its stance in Ukraine. But it's because of Modi that India has taken a neutral position and has managed to remain friends with the US and Russia without actually alienating the Ukrainians. And he's put that down to his own genius. And I think there's partly some truth to that. He's upheld India's old foreign policy doctrine of neutrality, but he's also been very clear that he's going into neither camp.
Kapil Komireddi, thank you for joining us. Kapil's book, Malevolent Republic, is available now. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For a look at how another term of Narendra Modi is being seen from Islamabad, we're joined now by the Pakistani journalist Beenish Javed, currently in Berlin. Beenish, first of all, is it possible to say how Pakistan will have seen this somewhat surprising election result?
So, Andrew, I think the officials in Pakistan are very cautiously watching the development happening in India. We have to be mindful of the fact that it is under the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi that Pakistan faced one of its worst setbacks in its foreign policy, especially its foreign policy vis-a-vis India. And that was in 2019, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government at the time abrogated Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. And basically what that meant was that the region of Kashmir that enjoyed a certain autonomy, it was stripped of that. And that to Pakistan was completely unacceptable. Pakistan downgraded the diplomatic relations with India. As of now, there are no high commissioners of Pakistan or India in their embassies, and trade has been suspended. And what we see, the environment right now is such that there is absolutely no signs that there would be a resumption of dialogue between India and Pakistan. Pakistan also has been seeing that Narendra Modi and his ministers during the election campaign have also used provocative language aimed at Pakistan. And that was also obviously not taken very well in Pakistan. So in this current environment, I do think that there is no excitement, I would say, in Pakistan to see Mr. Modi come into power for next 5 years.
Do you think there's any possibility of anything at all shifting as long as Narendra Modi remains Prime Minister of India? Or is the general attitude in Pakistan basically that it is what it is, we'll just have to wait until somebody else comes along?
So Pakistan and India almost always had a troubled relationship. There were few brief periods of peace, I would say. But what happened in the last couple of years is that Pakistan and India are in a situation of no peace and no war. And there is such a deadlock or a very strange stalemate between the relationship, and both sides have taken such hard positions. For instance, if I speak of India's position, their stance is that Pakistani state that sponsors terrorism into Indian territory, and they take such a hard stance on that, and they say that unless Pakistan would not completely address India's concern, there will be no dialogue. And for Pakistan, the application of Article 370 is something that pushes Pakistan to also take a harder stance, and they will also not compromise or show any flexibility towards any diplomatic move. So I am not very optimistic. I think the status quo would remain, which is very unfortunate because for many years, Pakistan and India did have a comprehensive dialogue, and Kashmir and terrorism were important parts of the agenda of the dialogue. And both were talking on these issues as well. And many would argue that, yes, both of the countries for now many years are going on without talking with each other, without having proper diplomatic relations. But I certainly believe, and I think many in India and Pakistan do believe, that both nuclear powers have to have some sort of like a diplomatic dialogue, have to talk to each other for the long-term stability and peace in South Asia.
Does this register, do you think, as a concern among Pakistani public opinion at all? Because even if the two countries don't like each other all that much and don't get on very well, there is still potentially that enormous trade relationship which has been rather left to go begging. I mean, would there be any electoral mileage for any Pakistani politician in standing up and saying, I'm going to make an effort to deal better with our neighbour?
This question is quite hard to answer because historically, what we have seen is that when civilian governments in Pakistan have shown an initiative to talk with India or to extend a hand of friendship towards India, there has been resistance from the military establishment. And in both countries, I think there are extremist elements also that do not favor the governments to come closer together and to work together. I would also argue that in the current situation, Pakistan is facing so many problems internally that India doesn't play a major part in Pakistani politics anymore. Pakistan has been going through an economic crisis for around 2 years now. Pakistan had a chronic political crisis that I would still say that it's still lingering on. Pakistan has huge problem of terrorism from the Pakistani Taliban. It also has a troubled western border with Afghanistan. So there are so many domestic issues that India is not something that a politician in Pakistan can take mileage from. But there are many people in Pakistan and India who still have very strong ties to each other. And that is, I think, what offers hope. For instance, my ancestral home is still in India. My grandparents, my maternal grandfather and my paternal grandfather both migrated from India during partition. And my mom has first cousins in India that she has not met in over like 40, 50 years. And they communicate on WhatsApp. There are heartbreaking stories of thousands and thousands of Pakistanis and Indians who are not able to connect, who are not able to meet, who have not been able to see each other for decades now. I think that willingness among people that may bring two countries sometimes together. In 2012, former Indian Foreign Minister S.M. Krishna visited Pakistan. In Pakistan had Hina Ramani Khar as its foreign minister. And during that visit, there were a lot of agreements signed between the two countries. And some of the agreements were related to relaxed visa policies for citizens of both countries. And that was welcomed widely in both countries. And there were headlines and there was a lot of support. So I would say that offers me hope that eventually, if there is a civil movement or a push from public, then might be that some politician from India or from Pakistan then may try to take mileage of that push from the public.
Is the view any different from Bangladesh, which I do know is a different country from Pakistan and does have a different relationship with India, but there are certain commonalities. Is that relationship any warmer?
India and Bangladesh enjoy really good relationship. Sheikh Hasina enjoys very good rapport with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and both, I think, governments benefit from each other. India really appreciates Sheikh Hasina for her efforts in controlling the threat of terrorism, especially emanating from what were used to be, what India claimed were centuries of terrorists that India would blame were operating out of Bangladesh and were attacking northeastern states. That problem has significantly been eased under Sheikh Hasina's government. India also, of course, wants to deter China. China is the biggest challenge for India in the region, and Bangladesh is also part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And India wants to maintain strong relationship with Bangladesh to make sure that influence of China can be controlled not only in Bangladesh but also Bay of Bengal. That's an important waterway in the Indian Ocean, and India with United States and other partner countries is trying to deter China from aggressively entering into that part of the world. India also is investing a lot in Bangladesh, in connectivity, in infrastructure. So both the governments, I think, would continue to benefit from each other.
Beenish Javed, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Where Myanmar is concerned, Narendra Modi appears to subscribe to the view that good fences make good neighbours. At a cost of perhaps $4 billion, he wants to build one the length of India's 1,600-kilometre border with Myanmar, in addition to the barrier already established between India and Bangladesh. Well, I'm joined now by Ronan Lee, academic and author of Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History and Hate Speech. Ronan, I guess the place to start is with the most obvious representation of India's relations with Myanmar, which is this fence that Modi wants to build along the border. Is Myanmar actually a security threat to India, or does Modi just perceive advantage in making it look like it might be?
He has perceived an advantage in portraying the problems that he's having on the border, particularly in Manipur, where you've got a state where it's been described as almost civil war type conditions, as an Indian state with civil war type conditions. And Modi is portraying the situation not as his domestic failing in terms of his policy approach, but rather that what India is having to deal with are the noisy neighbours, the difficult neighbours, and the solution is to build a fence to keep out the people that might want to come into Manipur from Myanmar, because there's ethnic groups there that have ethnic cousins on each side of the border. They have different ethnic names for the groups, but they're closely related. But the people on the border aren't fooled by this. They actually know what's going on. They know these are domestic problems. And this frustration that they've got, I think, has been reflected as the election results have rolled in, that there have been reversals for the BJP in those places like Manipur, Mizoram and Nagaland.
We have already seen him go big on the fence building thing. Quite a lot of India's border with Bangladesh is fenced off. Does he see Myanmar and Bangladesh as basically the same problem?
I think he sees the political solution as the same problem. It's sort of unclear sometimes how much of these strategies have been driven by people like Amit Shah, the Home Minister, that the idea of the fence, they may have perceived that that would play well with certain demographic groups. The BJP's line is always very much about India's Hindu heritage and India as a Hindu country. That's their political agenda. So the idea that they're holding back a potential hordes of arrivals from a Muslim majority country, I think they then see, well, if that's going to work as a political argument, maybe we can use the same argument about other groups as well. And we see that in the case of Myanmar. The fence really is about stopping Christian groups, so ethnic Chin, who is a predominantly Christian group, from entering into Manipur, where they have a sort of a relationship with the Kuki ethnic minority in that place. And I think the strategy has failed him. I think that the election results that we've seen come out of India, where the BJP's lost, 20% of their seats, I think that's a suggestion that voters within India aren't quite as fooled by this, that you might be able to sell these messages for a while, but ultimately people want you to deliver on things like the state of the economy, rather than trying to suggest that all the problems are associated with foreign policy issue and that the solution is a very straightforward, simple thing. I mean, people who know the border between India and Myanmar know that there's a reason it's a porous border, but it's not that there's large numbers of people that are going in one direction. It's that the border zone is porous because it's mountainous. I mean, it's difficult to cross. It's not an easy place to be crossing the border. But there are people who live in that border region who, for more than generations, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, have crossed one way and then the other because they've got family ties on each side.
I mean, it will probably, for those reasons, be quite a difficult place to build a fence as well. But whether or not building a new fence between India and Myanmar proves possible, Modi's concerns, as you've outlined it, seem to be more with non-state actors operating in Myanmar or out of Myanmar. How does he actually get on with the state in Myanmar? Is it even arguable that he and Myanmar's generals are actually broadly on the same side?
Well, he gets on with the generals very well. This is primarily the problem that I think that India has in terms of its relationship with Myanmar as a whole. Modi did not condemn the coup. I mean, it's a very unpopular coup within Myanmar when elected politicians in Myanmar were arrested and the generals came back into power. No condemnation from a country that presents itself to the world as the world's largest democracy. Modi's maintained very close relationships with the generals since that time, and a really weak relationship, if any, with the alternative government of Myanmar, with the National Unity Government. Now, he would probably portray this as a strategic autonomy on the part of India, that it's not following a sort of a Western view, it's not imposing sanctions, it's doing its own thing. It's maybe a little bit closer to China's approach. But it looks to me like he's following China's approach to Myanmar, but following it really badly. I mean, what China does in Myanmar is it does its best to have positive relationships with all sides. It has a relationship with the generals, but also it has a relationship with those who are quite likely now to come into power when the generals are removed. I mean, Myanmar is not a country where I wouldn't be betting that the generals will be in power in 2 years' time. And I think it would be important for India to have a relationship with the people who are likely to come into power.
But is that not just of a piece with Modi's general foreign policy of just not wishing to be drawn into things that India does not need to get drawn into? In refusing to condemn the coup and in refusing to make any kind of real outreach to the civic alternative, might he just be, again, enacting that policy of thinking, well, we don't really have a dog in this fight. It doesn't really matter to me all that much who runs Myanmar. We just need to work with whoever is in charge. And if that changes, we'll deal with that when the time comes.
Well, I think that's exactly the approach he's taken, but it's a risky approach. India felt it was left behind a little bit during the period of time when Myanmar was governed by Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy. India certainly felt that Aung San Suu Kyi's government developed strong ties with China through that period, and India was a little bit left behind. I think his focus on his close relationship with the generals is to try and remedy that a little bit. But the problem that he's got now is that his approach is not a politically pragmatic approach. It may be an approach that may have at one time seemed pragmatic, so you're right when you say that he's probably trying to avoid getting into a fight he doesn't need to. But there is a reality facing him, which is that a country that has a 1,600 kilometre land border with India, and where it's not the generals that control the border crossings. In reality, it's groups associated with the resistance that control the main links between Myanmar and India now, and he doesn't have any real relationship with those groups. So major projects, economic projects like the Caladan multimodal project, I mean, this is a $500 million project to provide access to those landlocked states of India. Well, that project's basically just not functioning. It hasn't functioned since the coup. But it was portrayed as very important to the economic future of those landlocked states. And I think that's some of the frustration that those Indian states have with Modi. It's been reflected in the election outcome, that they are frustrated that economic policies aren't being delivered, and there have been sold messages around why it is that the border region is troublesome for India, that they know that's not really true. And they kind of know that the problem is that Modi hasn't been light enough on his feet politically to deal with what is likely to be a change of administration in Myanmar. But also the reality today is that there is a resistance and there are the generals, and they each control significant amounts of territory within Myanmar. And the one that controls the territory adjacent to India is the resistance, is not the generals. But that's not the group that Modi's government has good links with.
Ronan Lee, thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. We're joined finally here in our Midori House studio by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute. Isabel, first of all, earlier this week we saw Taiwan's president congratulate Narendra Modi on his re-election. Narendra Modi chose to respond to that publicly and cheerfully. Modi would well have understood that China would bite, and indeed China did. So why did Modi do it?
I think Modi, particularly in the wake of a rather underwhelming election result, was keen to show that he was still a big, tough, strong leader. And what better forum to do that in than standing up to China? The reaction in China to his election victory was curious. It was mainly focused on clearly he's weaker, democracy's coming to bits. He won't cause as much trouble because, he hasn't got an overall majority. So on the Chinese side, they were celebrating his less than spectacular results. And I think that may also have provoked Modi into saying, regardless, I'm still Modi.
I mean, it has always been a pretty twitchy relationship between China and India, and it's a very consequential twitchy relationship. This is roughly half the Earth's population involved here. There have been various border dust-ups while Modi's been in charge, including one in 2020 in which 20-odd soldiers were killed. But has that been the exception? Would we say it is a fundamentally confrontational relationship?
It is, I think, fundamentally confrontational, but tempered by the fact that they do have a very large trading relationship and that quite long stretches go by in which there isn't violence on the border. There was a major war in 1961-62, and there is an unresolved border dispute which involves quite a lot of territory and claims on both sides. The Chinese have settled border disputes with many countries since 1949, but not this one. And that 2020 episode, where 20 Indian soldiers died, was celebrated by China. They put the officer in charge of the Chinese side of that dispute. They had him as a flag bearer at the Winter Olympics. So it was pretty pointed that, it was a very, very messy and horrible episode. And they congratulated the soldier who'd been in command. So these episodes of violence are intermittent, but there's a steady encroachment on the border by the Chinese in the shape of road building, of creeping across the border to occupy village sites or to build new villages. There's a lot of pressure on that border.
Is there much nervousness on either side about a proper conflagration of the sort that we have not seen since the brief Sino-Indian War of 1962?
Yes, I mean, it's a kind of armed hostility. China cultivates Pakistan. Pakistan finds China very useful because it keeps Indian troops, worried about the bigger issue rather than, the Indo-Pakistan conflict, which is another kind of constantly recurring theme. But of course, both India and China are nuclear powers. This could be an absolutely disastrous war should it happen. We got very close to a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, not much more than 15 years ago. I think both sides would pull back from a nuclear exchange because they would understand what the consequences were. But there are all sorts of proxy pressures that can be exerted. For example, they share major rivers. So all the major rivers of South Asia, on which 1.6 billion people depend, derive from the Qinghai Tibet plateaus. So from the cryosphere, which is in retreat. The Himalaya are a climate change hotspot. And a lot of dam building goes on. So there is a section of the Indian security establishment that is convinced that China can and will turn off the tap of the Brahmaputra. It's actually not possible. But nevertheless, that doesn't stop them from worrying about it. And for that to be another issue between them. And of course, there is the other very big issue, which is about to become another substantial confrontation, and that's the presence in India of the Tibetan exile community and the Tibetan exile government and the person of the Dalai Lama, who is now elderly, who may die at any moment, and there will be a massive confrontation over that, over who will select his reincarnation, whether India will cede to China or to the Chinese Communist Party the absolute right to select the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama as the Chinese want. There's no happy solution to this for either side. So that, I think, is going to keep relations strained for the foreseeable future.
I mean, other than Tibet, and India has periodically used that as a stick to poke China with, how much of a priority in terms of foreign policy is India to China? Does China, Xi Jinping in particular, spare India all that much thought, or do they regard their influence building elsewhere in Asia as more important, elsewhere in indeed Africa and South America as more important, their competition with the United States as more important?
Certainly the competition with the United States is the prime factor, and India's relationship with the United States is there, but it's not exclusive. India is also quite close to Russia. as we know, and for big historical reasons. And Russia is China's best friend. So, these relationships are quite nuanced in many ways. The view in China used to be that India was the best argument against democracy that you could possibly have. Because if you compared China's pace of development, China's kind of modernization of every aspect of its economy and many of its society, it had outstripped India by many factors. But now, India is actually, in population terms, it passed China last year, and in growth terms, it's growing at sort of 7%, and China's growing at maybe 3%. So there is a kind of feeling that it could be India's moment. And as China becomes more confrontational with more developed parts of the world, a lot of companies are looking to either seal off or remove their China operations and possibly relocate in India. So we're seeing more investment going into India. It's also true that there is a big trade relationship, and it's massively in China's favour. There's a huge imbalance in trade between China and India. The exact size of it is disputed because so much cheating goes on the Indian side for tax reasons, but nobody quarrels with the idea that it's very big.
As a final thought then, Modi, in the manner of most bellicose nationalists, is fond of summoning the spectre of external enemies, real or imagined. Have we seen, or do we anticipate him pulling that sort of stroke and involving China at any level, or is that what he thinks Pakistan is there for?
I think that's what Pakistan is there for. And actually, over the years, over the last decade or so, I've been quite surprised how passive India has been. For example, with the Chinese takeover of Nepal. Nepal, there's an open border between India and Nepal. Nepal was a Hindu kingdom, very much under Indian influence. And in the last 15, 20 years, China has simply moved in. And there wasn't really very much resistance. And you could point to Chinese, maneuverings around the Indian Ocean and think, well, India's beginning to look a little bit surrounded here and hasn't really responded very clearly to Chinese encirclement. And I think that they take the view that they don't really want to prod the tiger. Also, they're both in the BRICS. So, again, it's a nuanced relationship. Essentially, if you would ask an Indian leader how he sees the future, he would probably say there are two great Asian powers, India and China. If you ask a Chinese leader, there's really only one. And for them, I think India will also be the also-ran.
Isabel Hilton, thank you for joining us here on The Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.